they said the horse would kill her before the wall did. The Duke of Ravensmere stood at the edge of the paddock with his gloves still on, his jaw set in that terrible, elegant way of men who have decided a matter and expect the world to obey. His wife of 3 weeks stood before him in a borrowed riding habit, her hair still damp from the rain, her hands quiet at her sides. He had chosen the black stallion on purpose. Sable had thrown 4 grooms, broken the leg of a stable master, and once nearly killed the Duke himself at the north wall. That jagged stone rise which had defeated every rider who had ever attempted it. The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said only that if she wished to be called his Duchess in truth, she might mount the worst horse in his stable and take the wall he had never once cleared. The grooms turned their faces away. His mother, watching from the terrace, smiled the smile of a woman certain of a girl's ruin. And Isolde Wren, who had come to this house with nothing but a dead father's name and a mother's stubborn spine, walked toward the stallion as though she had been waiting for him all her life. She had not come to be a duchess. She had come, though she did not yet know it, to teach a proud man what a wall truly was. Isolde Wren was married to the Duke of Ravensmere on a grey October morning, in a chapel so cold that the priest's breath made small ghosts above the prayer book. She wore her mother's wedding gown, taken in twice at the waist because grief had thinned her, and lace at her throat that had been mended so often the pattern no longer matched itself. Her father, Sir Edmund Wren, had died owing money to half of Somerset, and the Duke had bought the debts as a man buys a field he does not particularly want, because the fence line pleases him. The marriage had been arranged in a single afternoon between the Duke's solicitor and Isolde's uncle, who was glad to be rid of her. Isolde had been told on a Tuesday. She had been married on the following Saturday. She had not seen her husband's face until he stood beside her at the altar, and even then he looked past her, as though the wall behind her held some more interesting truth. He was tall and dark, with the sort of features that painters admire and wives dread, a straight nose, a hard mouth, eyes the color of wet slate. Julian Ashcombe, 7th Duke of Ravensmere, was 38, a widower once, a soldier before that, and a man rumored to have loved only one thing in his life, which was a chestnut mare who had died beneath him at Waterloo. He said his vows in a voice like closing doors. He did not kiss her. In the carriage he read a letter, and when they arrived at Ravensmere he handed her down without meeting her eyes, gave her over to a housekeeper named Mrs. Hollis, and disappeared into a wing of the house she was not, it seemed, invited to enter. For 3 weeks she lived at Ravensmere as a ghost lives in a portrait. She was given a suite of rooms overlooking the east garden, where the roses had gone black with early frost. She ate her meals alone. She saw her husband twice, once in the library, where he nodded to her as one nods to a piece of furniture recently moved, and once on the stairs, where he stepped aside to let her pass and did not turn his head. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Cordelia, made her position clear at the first dinner they shared without him. She said, cutting her pheasant with small, precise strokes, that a woman of no fortune and no beauty ought to be grateful for a name, and ought not to expect more. Isolde, who had spent her girlhood nursing a mother through consumption and her adolescence keeping her father from the bottle, had learned long ago that gratitude was a currency the powerful demanded from those who had nothing else to give. She answered nothing. She ate her soup. She counted the silver on the sideboard and noticed 3 pieces missing. The challenge came on the 22nd day. It came, she later understood, because Julian had overheard his mother saying that the little Wren girl was clever, and cleverness in a wife he had not chosen was intolerable to him. He had returned from London that morning, mud to the knees, in a temper that made the footmen flatten themselves against the walls. He found Isolde in the library, reading. He asked her, without preamble, whether she rode. She said she did. He asked whether she was afraid of anything. She said, after a moment, that she was afraid of very little that could be helped and of nothing that could not. He looked at her then, properly, for the first time. And the look was not kind. An hour later she stood in the paddock, and he named the horse, and he named the wall, and he named the price of her place beside him. She understood then that he did not wish her to succeed. He wished her to refuse, so that he might have proof of her unworthiness and be rid of the shame of a marriage he had not wanted. She understood, too, that if she refused she would live the rest of her life in the East Wing, counting missing silver. She walked to the stallion. He rolled his eye at her and showed his teeth. She laid her hand flat on his neck, low down where the muscle was warmest, and she spoke to him in the tone her father had used with fractious dogs and frightened children. She did not mount. Not yet. She said, calmly, that she would ride the horse when she was ready, and not before, and that a wall which had never been cleared could be cleared only by patience. And patience could not be commanded like a servant. Then she turned and walked out of the paddock, past the Duke, past the Dowager on the terrace, past the silent grooms, and into the house. Behind her, Julian Ashcombe stood a long moment in the rain with his gloves still on, and did not know what had just happened to him. That night the fever took her. It had been coming for days, she thought afterwards, a small dry cough kept private, a chill she had refused to acknowledge because acknowledgement was a luxury she could not afford. She woke in the dark burning, unable to remember where she was, and when Mrs. Hollis came with a candle her face went white and she sent a boy running for the physician. The Duke was told. He did not come. He sent word from his study that the doctor's bill would be paid and that he was not to be disturbed. For 4 days Isolde lay in the great carved bed that had belonged to Julian's grandmother, and she did not know whether it was morning or evening. The physician bled her, which did not help. Mrs. Hollis, an old woman with a mouth like a locked box and eyes that had seen the house through 3 generations, sent the physician away on the 5th day and brought instead a poultice of mustard and a broth thick with barley, and sat by the bed through the night with her knitting. Isolde came back to herself slowly, as a swimmer comes up through dark water. The first thing she saw clearly was Mrs. Hollis's face, and the second was a small girl of perhaps 7 years, sitting on the hearthrug with a rag doll, watching her with grave dark eyes. The child was called Beatrice. She was, Mrs. Hollis said in a voice carefully stripped of expression, the Duke's ward. Her mother had been a governess in the house 6 years ago, and had died in childbirth, and the Duke had taken the infant in without comment and had, in the years since, provided for her without affection. She lived in the nursery at the top of the west wing with a nurse who drank and a tutor who did not come. She had not been introduced to Isolde because, Mrs. Hollis said, the Dowager did not wish it. Isolde looked at the child a long time. The child looked back, and did not smile, and did not run away. Isolde said, when she could manage it, that Beatrice might come nearer if she wished, and after some consideration Beatrice did, and laid the rag doll carefully on the coverlet as one lays down a gift. That was the beginning. When Isolde was well enough to walk, which was 10 days later, she did not go to her husband. She did not send for him. She went instead to the kitchens, and then to the still room, and then to the housekeeper's parlor, and she began, quietly, to look. She looked at the account books, which Mrs. Hollis had kept faithfully but which no one had audited in 2 years. She looked at the linen cupboards, which were bare. She looked at the servants' hall, where the beer was thin and the bread was stale, and at the stables, where a groom named Tom Fenner had a wife who was ill and no coal for her fire. She looked at the north wall, from a distance, and she said nothing about it to anyone. She wrote 3 letters. The first was to her father's old attorney in Bath, asking for a full accounting of what remained of the Wren estate, which she had been told was nothing, and which she suspected was not quite nothing. The second was to a horse breeder in Yorkshire whose name she had read in her father's letters. The third was to Beatrice's dead mother's sister, whom she found by inquiry, and to whom she wrote, without the Duke's knowledge, to say that the child was well and would be better. The Dowager Duchess observed all this and said nothing for a fortnight. Then, at dinner, she remarked that a duchess who involved herself in kitchen accounts was a duchess who had forgotten what she was. Isolde set down her spoon. She said, in a voice as quiet as she had used to the stallion, that a duchess who did not know what her household ate was a duchess who did not know whether she was being robbed. The Dowager's fork paused above her plate. She did not answer. That night, Isolde found 3 of the missing silver pieces returned to the sideboard, and a 4th, she suspected, being melted quietly somewhere in the village. Winter came down hard that year. The roads north closed in November, and Ravensmere, which had always been a house of drawn curtains and locked wings, became a house of drawn curtains, locked wings, and snow to the sills. The Duke had gone to London on some matter of Parliament and had not written. His mother had removed herself to the dower house at the far end of the park, where she kept her own establishment and her own grievances, and did not appear at Ravensmere for 3 weeks together. Isolde used the winter. She had Tom Fenner's wife brought into a warm room off the kitchen and nursed her herself, with Mrs. Hollis's approval and the still room's herbs, until the woman could sit up and take broth. She had coal sent to every cottage on the estate that needed it, and she paid for it out of the small allowance the Duke's solicitor sent her monthly, which she had spent on nothing else. She set the tutor's post to a young curate from the village called Mr. Alden, a serious man with ink-stained fingers who had lost his own child the year before and who came to the nursery 3 days a week and taught Beatrice her letters and her sums and, on Saturdays, a little Latin. She dismissed the nurse who drank, and hired in her place a widow from the village who sang the child to sleep in a low steady voice that Isolde could sometimes hear through the wall. She learned the estate. She rode out on a placid grey mare named Juno every fine morning, with Tom Fenner riding a discreet distance behind. And she learned the tenants in the fields and the state of the fences and the mill that was not working and the cottages whose roofs were bad. She wrote everything down in a small leather book. She learned, from the attorney in Bath, that her father had left a small property in Somerset which had been overlooked in the general wreck of his affairs, and which brought in £80 a year. And which was, in law, hers absolutely. She did not tell the Duke. She used the £80 to mend 2 roofs. She learned the stables. She learned them slowly, without fuss, in the hour after breakfast when the grooms did not expect her. She learned each horse by name and temper. She learned Sable last. She went to his stall every morning for 6 weeks with a piece of apple in her palm and stood on the other side of the bar and did not offer it, only spoke. Until at last the great black head came down and took the apple from her hand as gently as a child takes bread. She did not mount him. She did not yet need to. She learned the north wall. She walked out to it in the snow on a still afternoon in January and stood a long time looking at it. It was higher than she had first thought. It was built of old stone with an outward flare at the base and a downward slope on the far side, so that a horse coming at it must gather itself entirely. And a horse who mistrusted its rider by even a hair would refuse. She understood then why Julian had never cleared it. It was not the horse. It was the man. The wall did not answer to fear, and Julian Ashcombe, whatever face he wore, was a man who lived with fear as another man lives with a wife. She walked back to the house through the snow and she said nothing to anyone. The letter from Beatrice's aunt came in February. The aunt was a decent woman, married to a country apothecary, and she wrote with great care. She said she had not known where the child was. She said she had been told, at the time, that the infant had died with the mother. She said she would like, if it were possible, to see her niece. Isolde read the letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the drawer with her own mother's letters, and she wrote back to the aunt to say that Beatrice was well, and would remain at Ravensmere for the present. But that a visit in the spring might be arranged. She did not know yet what she meant to do with the truth. She only knew that Beatrice, who had begun to smile, and who now came running when Isolde entered a room, was not going to be given away. The Duke returned to Ravensmere on the 3rd of March, without warning, in a travelling coach mud to the axle, and found his house transformed. He noticed it before he was through the door. The gravel of the sweep had been raked. The lamps in the hall were lit, though it was still afternoon, and they had been polished. There were flowers, hothouse narcissi, on the table beneath the great staircase, in a bowl he did not recognize. The footman who took his coat was a boy he had never seen, who bowed properly and did not tremble. Mrs. Hollis met him in the hall with a face that gave nothing away, and told him that her Grace was in the estate office with Mr. Alden and would come down directly. Julian Ashcombe, 7th Duke of Ravensmere, did not go up to his rooms. He stood in his own hall as a man stands in a house he has half forgotten, and he waited. She came down the staircase in a plain grey gown, and her hair was dressed simply, and she carried a leather book under her arm. She was not the girl he had left. The girl he had left had been thin with grief and quiet with fear. This woman was still thin, but the thinness was of use, not sorrow. She moved as a woman moves who knows where every door in the house leads. She stopped 3 steps from the bottom and inclined her head, and she said, in the calm voice he half remembered from the paddock, that she trusted his journey had been comfortable. And that dinner would be served at 7, and that she would be glad to give him an account of the household at his convenience. He said, because he could think of nothing else, that she looked well. She said, I have been well, Your Grace. The Your Grace was not humble. It was polite. It was the politeness a magistrate uses with a man he does not entirely trust. She gave him his account at 8, in the library, standing on the far side of the great desk that had been his father's. She had the ledgers open. She had the tenant's book. She had a list of the repairs made and the repairs pending, and a list of the servants dismissed and the servants engaged, and a note of every shilling spent and every shilling saved. She had done, in 5 months, what his steward had failed to do in 5 years. He listened. He asked questions. She answered them without hesitation and without pride. She did not once refer to the paddock. She did not once refer to his silence during her illness, of which he had learned only that morning from Mrs. Hollis, and which had shaken him in a way he was not prepared to examine. He asked, at last, about Beatrice. Isolde closed the ledger. She said the child was in the schoolroom with Mr. Alden, and that she was learning her letters, and that she was a clever child and a lonely one, and that Isolde would be grateful if the Duke would visit her before he next left the house. He said, stiffly, that he had never known what to do with the child. She said, "You need not do anything with her, Your Grace. You need only see her." He looked at her a long time then. She met his eyes. She did not soften. He said, at last, that he would see the child in the morning. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the great bed that had been his father's, and he thought of the paddock, and of the fever he had not attended, and of the wall he had never cleared, and of the woman in the grey gown who had said Your Grace as one says the name of a stranger. He thought, for the first time in many years, that he did not know what kind of man he was. Their spring was a wary thing. He stayed at Ravensmere. He said nothing about London and nothing about returning, and Isolde asked nothing. He visited Beatrice in the schoolroom the morning after his arrival and stood in the doorway a long moment before he came in, and the child, who did not know him, curtsied prettily as Mr. Alden had taught her, and offered him her slate to see. He read the slate. He said, "Very good," in a voice that surprised him by cracking a little, and he did not stay long, but he came again the next day, and the day after that. He rode out with Isolde on the third morning, on his own bay hunter, and she on Juno, and he saw the estate through her eyes, which was to say he saw it as it truly was, and had been, and might be. He saw the mended roofs. He saw the mill, whose wheel was turning again because she had found the money to repair it out of £80 a year he had never known she had. He saw Tom Fenner touch his hat to her in a way that was not the way servants touch their hats to their masters, but the way men salute a commander who has kept them alive through a bad winter. He said very little on that ride. When they came back to the yard he dismounted and held out his hand to help her down, and she permitted it, and their fingers touched through her glove, and he felt it, and she felt it. And neither of them acknowledged it. The first real quarrel came in April, over the child. He had spoken, in passing at dinner, of sending Beatrice to a school in Bath when she was 10. He had meant it kindly. He had thought it what one did. Isolde set down her wine glass and said, quietly, that Beatrice would not be sent away, that Beatrice had been sent away once already, into a nursery no one visited. And that she would not be sent away again while Isolde lived in this house. He said, coloring, that the decision was his. She said, then make it a different one. The silence after that was long. The dowager, who was dining with them that evening, put down her fork with visible satisfaction, expecting a scene. She did not get one. The Duke looked at his wife across the table. He said, at last, that they would speak of it another time. Isolde inclined her head. She said, as you wish, Your Grace. And she resumed her soup. That night he came to the door of her sitting room, which he had never done before, and he knocked, which he had certainly never done before. She admitted him. She was in a wrapper of dark blue wool, with her hair in one long braid down her back, and she did not rise. He stood in the doorway. He said, without preamble, that he had been a poor guardian to the child, and that he would consider what she had said, and that he had not meant to wound her. She looked up at him. She said, you have wounded me, Your Grace, in many ways since I came to this house. The child is only one of them. He said, I know. She said, do you? He came into the room then, and closed the door behind him, and sat, because his legs would not quite hold him, in the chair opposite hers. He did not speak for a long time. She let him not speak. At last he said, quietly, that in the paddock, on that first day, he had wished her to refuse, so that he might have proof he had not chosen wrongly. He said he had not chosen her at all, he had bought her, and he had known it, and he had hated himself for it, and had taken his hatred out on her because she was the nearest object of it. He said he had been a coward. She listened. When he had finished she said, "Thank you for telling me the truth. It does not undo it. But I am glad to know it." He said, "Isolde." It was the first time he had used her name. She did not answer to it. She said, "Good night, Your Grace." And after a moment he rose, and bowed, and went out. But the door between them, which had been iron, was, that night, only wood. It was Beatrice who found the letters, quite by accident, in the little writing desk in the west sitting room where no one went. She was hunting for a lost hair ribbon, and she pulled at a drawer that stuck, and it came away in her hand, and behind it, wedged against the back of the desk, was a bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon. She brought them to Isolde, because at 7 Beatrice brought everything to Isolde. Isolde untied the ribbon in the privacy of her own room, and she read them, because she had learned by then that a woman in a great house does not have the luxury of leaving letters unread. They were from Julian's first wife, Adelaide, who had died 6 years ago in a hunting accident and about whom no one in the house ever spoke. They had been written in the last year of her life. They were not letters to Julian. They were letters to her lover, a Colonel Marchmont, whom Isolde had never heard of, and they had never been sent. Adelaide had been going to leave Julian. She had been going to run to Marchmont in Ireland. She had died 3 days before she meant to go, thrown from her horse at a low fence she had jumped 100 times, and Julian, who did not know about Marchmont, had blamed himself for the accident because they had quarreled that morning about a matter Isolde now understood he had never known the shape of. Isolde sat with the letters a long time. Then she went to find her husband. He was in the estate office, alone, going over the spring accounts by the light of a single lamp. She closed the door behind her. She laid the letters on the desk in front of him. She said, "You should read these. And then we will burn them." He read them. It took him a long time. He did not weep, but his hand, when he turned the pages, was not entirely steady. When he had finished he sat a long moment looking at nothing. Then he said, "She did not love me." Isolde said, "No." He said, "I have carried her death for 6 years." Isolde said, "I know. You need not carry it any longer." He looked up at her then, and his face was the face of a man who has been walking in the dark and has stepped, unexpectedly, into a room with a fire in it. He said, "Why are you giving me this?" She said, "Because a man who does not know the truth cannot mend himself. And I would like you to be mended, Julian." It was the first time she had used his name. They burned the letters that night in the estate office fire, one by one, and neither of them spoke while they burned. When the last was ash he took her hand across the desk, and she let him take it, and they sat that way a long time in silence, while the lamp burned low and the house slept around them. And something in him, which had been closed since Waterloo and closed harder since Adelaide, began, very slowly, to open. The trouble began in May and came from 3 directions at once. The first was the neighbour, Lord Carrick, whose land bordered Ravensmere on the west, and who had been quietly moving his fences for 2 years while Julian was absent, and who now, discovering Julian returned and his wife inconveniently competent, produced a claim to a strip of woodland that had been in the Ashcombe family since the Restoration. He brought a lawyer down from London. He spoke of an old boundary dispute. He implied, over brandy in Julian's own library, that a gentleman might settle such matters privately, between men, if the gentleman's wife did not interfere. Julian, who a year before might have signed anything to be rid of the man, looked at him coldly across the desk and said that his wife had the estate books and that any discussion of boundaries would take place in her presence. Carrick's face, at that, was worth a small property. The second trouble was harder. A letter came from London, from the Prime Minister's private secretary, requesting the Duke's presence in town on a matter of the Corn Laws which required, they said, his particular voice in the Lords. The letter was polite. The letter was also, they both understood, not a request. Julian read it and set it down and said, without looking at Isolde, that he would refuse. She said, "You will not refuse." He looked up. She said, "You will go. You will speak. You will do the work you were born to do. And you will come back." He said, "The last time I went to London I did not come back for 5 months." She said, "The last time you went to London, you did not have a reason to come back." He looked at her a long moment. He said, "Do I have one now?" She did not answer that. She said, instead, "Beatrice will expect you for her birthday in July. See that you are not late." He went to London on the 12th of May. He wrote to her every third day. The letters were, at first, formal, and then less formal, and then, by the end of the second week, the letters of a man writing to the only person in the world whose opinion he needed. She wrote back in the same measure, and she kept his letters in the drawer with her mother's, which was, though he did not know it, the drawer she reserved for the letters that mattered. The third trouble came in June, and it was the worst. It came in the person of a woman named Lady Sabine Ellsworth, who arrived at Ravensmere in a hired carriage on a hot afternoon with 2 trunks and no invitation. She was beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful at 35, which is to say deliberately, and expensively, and with a great deal of practice. She had been, some years before, an intimate friend of the Duke, in the manner in which certain widows are the intimate friends of certain widowed dukes. She had come, she said sweetly to Isolde over tea in the yellow drawing-room, to renew old acquaintance, and to see for herself the little country wife of whom she had heard such interesting reports. Isolde poured her tea. Isolde asked after her journey. Isolde inquired, with grave courtesy, how long her ladyship intended to stay. Lady Sabine, who had expected either tears or claws and had been prepared for both, was disconcerted by neither, and said, uncertainly, that she thought perhaps a fortnight. Isolde said that a fortnight would be delightful, and that she would have the blue rooms prepared, and that his Grace, who was expected home on Saturday, would no doubt wish to greet her ladyship himself. The Dowager Duchess Cordelia, who had come up from the Dower House for this express purpose, said afterwards, with a small vicious smile, that she supposed Isolde would now see what sort of man she had married. Isolde said, without turning her head, "Madam, I saw what sort of man I had married on the day he asked me to ride the worst horse in his stable. I have not been surprised by him since. Julian came home on Saturday, as he had said he would. He was dusty from the road. He came into the hall and found Lady Sabine arranged prettily on the sofa in the drawing-room, in a pose she had used on him before, in a dress cut lower than a country afternoon strictly required. He looked at her a moment. He bowed. He said, courteously, that he was glad to see her well, and that she would be more comfortable, no doubt, at the King's Head in the village, where he would be pleased to send her carriage in the morning. Lady Sabine's face went white. The Dowager's face went whiter. Isolde, who had come in behind him, said nothing at all. He turned to his wife. He said, in front of them all, "Madam, I have missed you." He offered her his arm. She took it. They went into dinner, the two of them alone, and left Lady Sabine and the Dowager to whatever supper they could arrange between them. That night, in the estate office, he asked her, quietly, whether he had done well. She said, "You did well, Julian." He said, "Then may I ask you something?" She said, "You may." He said, "The wall." "My wall. Will you ride it?" She looked at him a long time. She said, "Not yet." Chapter 8. She rode it in September, on a bright cold morning, 3 days before their first wedding anniversary. She had told no one. She had risen before dawn, dressed herself in her old riding habit, walked down to the stables in the grey light, and led Sable out herself, without waking Tom Fenner. The great black horse came to her hand quietly now. He had been coming to her hand quietly for months. She saddled him herself. She mounted him in the yard as the first light was touching the tops of the beeches. She rode him out through the park gate at a walk, and she did not look back at the house. She warmed him up along the north ride, at a trot, then a canter, then a long steady gallop across the top field. She felt him gather beneath her. She felt him understand what she wanted. When she turned him towards the wall he did not check. He did not swerve. He lengthened his stride and he came at it in a straight true line as though he had been waiting all his life to be asked properly. He rose beneath her. For one long suspended moment there was nothing between her and the sky. Then the far side of the wall came up to meet them, and he took the drop clean, and the world was on the other side. She pulled him up in the meadow beyond. She sat a moment breathing. She was crying, though she had not meant to be, and she did not know exactly why. She patted the horse's black neck, which was hot and dark with sweat, and she said, into his ear, "Thank you." When she rode him back into the yard, the sun was fully up. And Julian was standing there in his shirt sleeves, his coat thrown over the paddock rail, his hair uncombed, his face the color of a man who has been told a truth he cannot at first believe. Tom Fenner, standing behind him, had tears running plainly down his weathered face and did not bother to hide them. Julian did not speak. He came to her stirrup. He held up his hands, and she came down into them, and he did not put her down at once. He held her against him as though she might vanish. His face was in her hair. He was shaking. He said, at last, into her hair, "You could have been killed." She said, "So could you have been. Every time you refused it." He said, "I never refused it because of the horse." She said, "I know." He said, "I refused it because I was afraid." She said, "I know that too." He drew back and looked at her. His eyes were wet, and he did not trouble to hide it, and she loved him for it, though she did not yet say so. He said, "You are the wall I never cleared. Do you understand me? Every wall in this house, every one, and you jumped them all while I stood in London signing papers I did not care about. I have been a fool, Isolde. I have been a proud and frightened fool, and you have been the making of me, and I do not know how to ask you to forgive it, but I am asking." She looked at him. She said, quietly, "I forgave you in April, Julian. I only did not tell you, because you had not yet earned to know it." He said, "And now?" She said, "Now you have." He kissed her then, in the yard. In front of Tom Fenner and 2 stable boys and a scullery maid who happened to be crossing with a basket of eggs, and none of them ever forgot it. And the scullery maid told the story at her own wedding 30 years later, and swore that on that morning in September she had seen a proud man become a good one in the space of a single breath. They walked back to the house together, leading Sable between them. Beatrice was on the terrace in her nightgown, having heard the commotion, and she came flying down the steps and flung herself at Isolde's skirts, and Julian, who had never in his life picked the child up, picked her up now, and set her on his shoulder, and carried her the rest of the way to the house. Inside, in the hall, with the child on his shoulder and his wife's hand in his, he said, to no one in particular and to the whole house at once, that he had ridden past his own wall for 6 years. And that today his Duchess had shown him the way over it, and that from this day forward Ravensmere would be a house that cleared its walls, and not a house that turned from them. The dowager, who had come down at the noise, said nothing. She looked at Isolde a long moment. Then she inclined her head, very slightly, in the smallest curtsy she had made to anyone in 40 years, and she went back upstairs without a word. And from that day treated Isolde as she treated the reigning queen, with a distant, respectful, and slightly frightened courtesy. They had a long life after that. They had 3 children of their own in the years that followed, and Beatrice was raised as their eldest daughter, and her aunt came to visit every summer. And the truth of her birth was never a shame in that house but only a piece of its history. Julian took his seat in the Lords and did the work he had been born to do, and he came home to Ravensmere as often as he could, and Isolde ran the estate at his side. And no silver went missing from the sideboard again. Sable lived to be 22, and was buried under the beech tree by the north wall, with a small stone that bore no name, only a date, and beneath the date, in Isolde's own hand, the words, "He carried me over." The wall itself was never taken down. On fine mornings, when the light was right, you could sometimes see the Duke and Duchess of Ravensmere riding out towards it together, side by side, at an easy pace. As people ride who no longer have anything to prove to anyone, least of all to each other. If this story moved you, if you felt Isolde's quiet courage and Julian's slow, hard-won return, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment telling me which scene stayed with you most, and share it with someone who loves a truly earned happy ending. Subscribe to the channel for more long-form Regency and Victorian romances, where proud men learn better and quiet women rise into their power. Thank you for spending this hour at Ravensmere with me. Light a candle, pour something warm, and I will see you at the next story.